My grandfather is a billionaire, but he found me on a dirty cot in a homeless shelter. While I was surviving a hurricane in rags, my guardian was blowing my $3 million trust fund on diamonds and private tutors for her favorite daughter. For years she lied, calling me worthless, but today the truth is out. Stay tuned to see how my grandfather turned her luxury life into a total nightmare. My name is Clara Thorne, and this is the moment my world shifted on its axis. It was another stifling afternoon at the Emergency Relief Center in coastal Texas. Weeks had passed since the hurricane tore through the city, leaving a wake of shattered lives and debris. I was handing out bottled water and supplies to families who had lost everything, dressed in the same worn-out jeans and donated t-shirt I'd been living in for days. A man in a tailored suit approached me, looking entirely out of place among the plastic crates and folding cots. He didn't speak at first, he simply stared at me as if I were an apparition. Finally, he drew me away from the bustle of the crowd and asked in a low, trembling voice, "Have you ever received any financial support from your grandfather?" I felt my pulse stutter. No one had ever mentioned a grandfather, let alone money. The people who raised me after my parents were gone had always insisted he wanted nothing to do with me, that he held me responsible for the tragedy that took my mother's life. "No," I told him, my voice flat. "I've never received a single cent." His face turned a ghostly shade of gray, as if he had just been handed a death sentence. That one question changed the trajectory of my life. Somewhere, a trust fund worth over $3 million had been drained to the last penny, and I was about to find out who had taken it. To understand why this man had traveled all the way from Colorado to find me, one must look back to the moment the facade began to crumble. Arthur Thorne sat alone in his executive office on the highest floor of a glass spire in Denver. The mountain range stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but his gaze was fixed on a thin manila folder delivered by a private courier. He opened it with hesitant fingers. The first few pages were standard background checks. Then came the photographs. The young woman in the pictures had warm, sun-kissed skin, and thick hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. She wore faded denim and a plain gray shirt bearing the logo of a local relief organization. In one shot, she was handing a bottle of water to an elderly man on a cot. In another, she was lifting heavy boxes of supplies under a white tent. Her face showed the deep lines of exhaustion, but there was a quiet, familiar determination in her eyes that made Arthur's chest tighten. Clara Thorne. His granddaughter. The investigator's summary was blunt. After the hurricane hammered the Texas coast, Clara had been living in a temporary shelter. She wasn't a guest, she was a volunteer, working grueling hours every day. The report noted that she possessed no significant assets, no active bank accounts, and no property in her name. Meanwhile, the family home in an upscale suburb had already been repaired and reoccupied by her legal guardian and her younger daughter. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, the folder resting on the mahogany desk. He had always assumed the trust he established 19 years ago was being handled with integrity. $10,000 had been deposited every month without fail, a sum that should have grown to well over $3 million by now. The account was in Clara's name, but as her guardian after Julian's death, Miriam Vance had full authority to withdraw funds for Clara's upbringing, education, and welfare. The lawyers had assured him the arrangement was ironclad. He had signed the documents in a fog of suffocating grief shortly after his daughter, Evelyn, died from complications during childbirth. At the time, the idea of raising a newborn while managing a real estate empire felt like an impossible task. When Julian remarried a few years later and Miriam gave birth to Sophie, it seemed like the perfect solution, a stable home, and a new family for his granddaughter. Arthur rubbed his aching temples. He had never demanded detailed audits. A brief email or a holiday card from Miriam once a year had been enough to ease his conscience. She always wrote that Clara was thriving, focused on her studies, and well-adjusted. He had believed it because believing was easier than facing the truth. Now the photographs told a story of neglect. A 19-year-old woman sleeping on a cot in a gymnasium. No car, no designer clothes, and no sign of the financial security he thought he had provided. He picked up his phone and dialed the investigator, Silas Reed. "Tell me again why she's still there," Arthur said, skipping any pleasantries. Silas's voice was professional and cool. The Guardian's residence was damaged, but it was fully restored within weeks using insurance and personal funds. The younger daughter moved back immediately. Clara chose to stay and assist with the relief efforts. She told the staff she's used to making her own way. Arthur's grip tightened on the handset. Chose to stay, or wasn't given a choice? "That's difficult to confirm without direct access," Silas replied. "On paper, everything looks legitimate. No police reports, no complaints." Arthur thanked him and hung up. He reopened the folder, flipping to the bank transfer records. The deposits were all there, automatic, monthly, never missed. But there were no corresponding statements showing where the money had actually gone. The trust language allowed the Guardian broad discretion. He had trusted that language. He stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. He thought of Evelyn, her laugh and her stubborn refusal to take the easy path. She had married Julian Vance, a man with big dreams and a steady heart. Then an accident had taken Julian when Clara was only 15. Arthur had sent flowers, increased the monthly deposit, and accepted Miriam's assurances that the girl was in good hands. Now doubt seeped in like a cold draft. He wasn't ready to accuse her yet, but the questions were piling up. Why was there no college fund? Why was she wearing donated clothes? Arthur returned to his desk and booked the earliest flight to Texas. He told his assistant to clear his schedule for the week, citing a personal emergency. As the car carried him through the mountain air toward the airport, he looked at the photographs one last time. Clara's smile in one of the images reminded him painfully of Evelyn. He had already missed so much. Whatever the truth was, he needed to hear it from her. "Tell me again why she's still there," Arthur said, his voice tight. Silas's response was characteristically level. The residence was repaired within weeks. Insurance and private funds covered the bulk of it. The younger daughter, Sophie, moved back in immediately. Clara, however, chose to stay behind to help with the relief efforts. She told the center staff she's used to making her own way. Arthur's grip on the phone turned his knuckles white. Chose to stay, or was she never invited back? "That's a distinction I can't verify without a direct confrontation," Silas replied. "There are no police reports, no calls for service. On paper, it's a picture of domestic stability." Arthur thanked him and ended the call. He opened the manila folder again, focusing on the bank transfer records. The deposits were consistent, automatic, monthly, never late. But there were no receipts, no invoices, no paper trail showing how Miriam had spent a penny of it. The trust documents granted the Guardian broad discretion to act in the interest of the beneficiary. He had relied on that legal jargon, assuming common decency would do the rest. He stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The rugged silhouette of the Rockies loomed in the distance, but his mind was miles away, anchored in the past. He thought of Evelyn. He remembered her laugh, her fierce independence, and the way she'd insisted on becoming a schoolteacher despite his offers to fund a path through medical school. She had married Julian, a high school coach who shared her vision of a simple, meaningful life. When the accident took Julian when Clara was only 15, Arthur had done what he knew best. He sent flowers, increased the monthly allowance, and accepted Miriam's polite, distant assurances that everything was under control. Now, doubt moved through him like a cold draft. It wasn't an accusation yet, just a series of questions that refused to be silenced. Why was there no record of a college fund? Why was no vehicle registered in her name? Why was she still wearing clothes that looked like they came from a donation bin? Arthur returned to his desk and booked the first flight to the Texas coast. He left that evening, carrying a slim selection of the trust records and transfer confirmations, nothing too aggressive, just enough to start a conversation. As his car navigated the Denver traffic toward the airport, Arthur stared at the digital photos on his tablet. Clara's smile in one particular shot was a painful echo of Evelyn at that same age. He had already missed nearly 2 decades of her life. Whatever the truth was, he wouldn't let another day pass without hearing it from her. The flight south was mercifully short. By the time the wheels touched the tarmac, night had settled over the coast, and the heavy, humid air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. Arthur checked into a quiet hotel, showered, and slept a fitful, shallow sleep. Early the next morning, he rented a basic sedan, something nondescript, lacking any luxury emblems, and drove toward the coordinates Silas had provided. The route took him through neighborhoods that still wore the jagged scars of the hurricane. Blue tarps covered roofs like plastic scabs, piles of debris sat rotting at the curbs, and the air was filled with the persistent whine of chainsaws. He parked a block away and walked the remaining distance, the folder tucked firmly under his arm. The shelter had taken over a local community center gymnasium, with white tents sprawling across the parking lot to handle the overflow. Volunteers in neon vests directed a slow trickle of cars. Arthur adjusted his tie, suddenly acutely aware of how his tailored suit must look in a place defined by loss. He stepped through the chain-link gate, his heart beating with a frantic rhythm he hadn't felt in years. The Texas sun beat down without mercy, baking the asphalt. The air was a thick mixture of smells: grilled meat from a volunteer cookout, industrial-strength disinfectant, and the lingering dampness of the receding floodwaters. A woman in a volunteer vest approached him near the entrance. Her name tag read Mrs. Miller, site director. She had weary, kind eyes and carried a battered clipboard. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over his suit with polite curiosity. Arthur cleared his throat, trying to find his voice. "I'm looking for Clara Thorne. I was told she's volunteering here." Mrs. Miller's expression softened instantly. "She's one of our best. Follow me." She led him through a side door into the main building. The hallway was narrow, crowded with stacked boxes of diapers, bottled water, and cleaning supplies. Voices echoed from the gymnasium ahead, the sound of children playing, mixed with the low murmur of adults coordinating in a blend of English and Spanish. The scent of coffee and bleach hung heavy in the air. They emerged into a vast, open space where rows of folding tables had been converted into distribution lines. Families waited with a quiet, practiced patience. Volunteers sorted through canned goods and hygiene kits with methodical speed. Clara was there, standing at the end of a long table. She was guiding a young mother with 2 small children through the selection process, pointing out sizes for kids' clothes. Her voice was soft and patient despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. Her hair was pulled back, a few stray locks framing a face that was the living image of the daughter Arthur had lost. She wore simple cargo shorts and a t-shirt with the sleeves rolled up as she reached for a box of infant formula. Arthur stopped at the edge of the room, watching her for several minutes. The way she knelt to speak eye level with the children, the genuine, gentle smile she offered the mother, it stirred something deep and agonizing within him. Finally, he stepped forward. Clara looked up as he approached, her expression shifting from focused professional to cautiously polite. "Excuse me," Arthur said quietly. "Are you Clara Thorne?" She straightened up, wiping her hands on her shorts. "Yes, that's me. Do I know you?" He hesitated, the weight of 19 years of silence pressing down on him. "My name is Arthur Thorne," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm your grandfather." The air in the community center was a heavy mixture of stale coffee and industrial bleach. Arthur watched from the shadows of the entrance as Clara moved with a practiced, weary grace between the rows of folding tables. She was guiding a young mother through the stacks of supplies, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the middle of the chaotic room. Her hair was pulled back, though several dark strands had escaped to frame a face that looked hauntingly like the daughter Arthur had lost nearly 2 decades ago. She wore simple cargo shorts and a t-shirt with the sleeves pushed up, lifting a heavy box of infant formula with a strength that seemed born of necessity. Arthur stood at the edge of the gymnasium for a long time, simply watching. The way she knelt to speak to the children, meeting them at their eye level, it stirred a deep, jagged pain in his chest. Finally, he forced his feet to move forward. Clara looked up as he approached. Her expression shifted from professional focus to a cautious, polite curiosity. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice low. "Are you Clara Thorne?" She straightened her back and wiped her hands on her shorts. "I am. Have we met?" He searched for the right words, but there were no words for 19 years of silence. "My name is Arthur Thorne. I'm your grandfather." The world seemed to go quiet for a heartbeat. Clara's eyes widened, but she didn't offer a smile or a hand. She glanced around at the busy room, then nodded toward a side exit near the back of the building. "Let's talk over there," she said. They stood in the shaded hallway, the noise of the relief center muffled by the heavy doors. Clara crossed her arms, not out of hostility, but out of a clear, instinctive need for a barrier. Arthur pulled out his phone and found an old photograph of Evelyn at 19. She was standing on a sun-drenched pier, laughing at the camera, her wrist turned just enough to reveal a small, heart-shaped birthmark. "Your mother had this mark on her left wrist," he said softly. "And you have the exact same one, don't you?" Clara looked down at her own arm. When she looked back up, her gaze had softened, though the suspicion remained etched in the corners of her eyes. "No one ever told me about a birthmark," she said. "Miriam never mentioned you at all, except to say you didn't want anything to do with us after my father died. She told me you blamed me for what happened to Mom." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. He kept his voice steady through the sudden ache in his throat. "I'd like to explain everything, if you'll let me. Perhaps over dinner tonight. There is a quiet restaurant near my hotel." Clara studied him, weighing the men against the ghost she'd been told about. "I have a shift until 6, she said finally. "I can meet you at 7, but only for an hour. I have to be back here early in the morning." "That's more than fair," Arthur replied. "I can send a car for you." "I'll find my own way," she said firmly. "Just text me the address." He gave her his number, and she typed it into a basic, older model phone. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back into the gymnasium, resuming her work as if the conversation had been nothing more than a routine inquiry. Arthur spent the afternoon in a nearby cafe, nursing a cup of black coffee he barely tasted. His mind kept returning to the birthmark. He had used it as a key, something only family would recognize, something Miriam couldn't have easily explained away. Clara's reaction confirmed she was living in a vacuum of her own history, stripped of even the smallest details of her mother's life. By 7 o'clock, he was seated at a corner table in a quiet seafood restaurant overlooking the Gulf. He had arrived early, leaving the legal folder in his hotel room to avoid overwhelming her too soon. Clara arrived exactly on time. She had changed into clean jeans and a simple blouse, practical and modest, yet she wore them with a dignity that reminded him of her mother. The hostess led her to the table. "Thank you for coming," Arthur said as she sat. She nodded, taking a small sip of water. "I almost didn't. That photo. I've never seen a picture of her like that. It made me curious." The conversation started tentatively. They ordered light meals, grilled fish for him, a salad for her. Arthur asked about her work at the shelter. "It keeps me busy," she said. "After the hurricane hit, Miriam told me the house repairs were going to take months. She said with the contractors coming in and out, space would be tight. She suggested I stay here and help with the relief efforts, since I already knew most of the families in this neighborhood." Arthur listened, noting the way she phrased it. Suggested, not insisted. There was no bitterness in her tone, only a weary, flat acceptance of her circumstances. "And what about Sophie?" he asked gently, referring to her younger sister. Clara shrugged. She went back home as soon as her school reopened. She has her dance classes and her friends. She calls me lazy for staying here so long, but someone has to help these people. The casual way she described the disparity between her life and her sister's broke Arthur's heart a little further. Miriam was living in a fully restored home while Clara slept on a cot in a gymnasium, and Clara had been convinced that this was her own noble choice. Arthur steered the conversation away from the looming shadow of finances, focusing instead on the memory of the woman who connected them. "Your mother always wanted to be an elementary school teacher," he said. "She spent her weekends volunteering at after-school programs, even back when she was in college." Clara's eyes lit up with a sudden, genuine spark of interest. "I never knew that." Miriam never really talked about her life. They lingered over their coffee as the evening deepened. Clara asked tentative, careful questions about Evelyn's childhood, listening with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail. Arthur kept his stories light, sharing memories of family dinners and trips to the mountains, careful not to overwhelm her. As the hour drew to a close, Clara glanced at her phone. "I should head back," she said. Arthur stood as she did. "Thank you for trusting me this far." She paused at the table, her expression unreadable. "Maybe one step at a time." He watched her walk away, her figure disappearing toward the bus stop in the humid night air. Back in his hotel suite, Arthur sat on the balcony, staring out at the dark expanse of the Gulf. The dinner had provided more questions than answers, but a fragile thread of connection had been spun. Clara hadn't run. She had listened. For now, that was enough. The large windows of the restaurant framed the Atlantic, the waves barely visible under the pale moonlight. Arthur and Clara remained at their corner table, the remains of their dinner long since pushed aside. He waited until the server had refilled their water one last time, before reaching into his briefcase. He placed a slim folder on the white tablecloth, and opened it to a highlighted summary. "This is something I've carried with me since I landed," he said quietly. Clara leaned forward, her posture still guarded but her curiosity piqued. The page was a ledger of dates stretching back nearly 2 decades, each entry followed by a deposit of $10,000, month after month. "These are the transfers I made into a trust fund established in your name immediately after your mother passed," Arthur explained. "The total has surpassed $3 million by now. It was intended to cover everything, your education, your living costs, whatever you might have needed while growing up." Clara stared at the numbers, her fork forgotten in her hand. She traced a line of text with a trembling finger, as if trying to verify the paper was real. "I've never seen this," she whispered. "No one ever told me there was a trust." Arthur nodded slowly, keeping his voice neutral to hide the rising tide of his anger. "When your father remarried and Miriam became your legal guardian, the account was structured to allow her to withdraw funds for your welfare. Housing, food, tuition, that's standard procedure for a minor." He didn't add an accusation, he simply laid out the facts. Clara's brow furrowed as she processed the information. "So all this money, it was supposed to be mine." "That was the sole intention," Arthur replied. "I trusted the system, and the people in your life, to use it for your benefit." Clara sat back, folding her hands in her lap. The shock in her eyes shifted into a more complex blend of confusion and a quiet, old hurt. Arthur pulled out his phone and dialed a contact listed as Caleb Ross, his longtime attorney. The call connected almost instantly. "Caleb, it's Arthur. I'm with Clara now. I need a full forensic trace on the trust activity. Every withdrawal and transfer from the last 5 years, at the very least. Focus on the largest sums." Caleb's voice was professional and steady over the speaker. "I can begin pulling the digital statements tonight, but a full review of the vendor invoices will take a few days. I'll need a signed authorization from you, and ideally from Clara once we confirm her status." Arthur looked across the table. Clara gave a small, resolute nod. "We'll have that sorted by tomorrow," Arthur said. "Keep me updated." He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Silence settled over the table, broken only by the distant clatter of the kitchen. Clara spoke first, her voice low and tight. After my dad's accident. I was 15. Everything changed at home. Miriam started focusing almost entirely on Sophie. New clothes, the best private schools, elite dance lessons. I was told I needed to pitch in, to take part-time jobs at local shops to cover my own basic needs. Arthur listened without interruption, his coffee sitting untouched. She told me it built character, Clara continued. Sophie picked up on it too. She'd make these little comments about how I didn't need much anyway. I just figured that was how life was after losing a parent. I thought money was tight for everyone. She shrugged, but the movement carried the weight of years of quiet, forced acceptance. Arthur felt a heavy stone of guilt settle in his chest. He had sent those deposits religiously, convinced they were a substitute for his presence. I should have asked for more updates, he said finally. I let the distance between us become an excuse. Clara met his gaze. Why didn't you ever visit? Or even call? The question was direct, stripped of anger but full of a deep, searching need. Arthur exhaled slowly. Grief is a hollow thing. Losing Evelyn broke something in me that I didn't know how to fix. I threw myself into my work and convinced myself that the money was my way of providing for you. Miriam sent occasional photos and notes saying you were doing well. I didn't push for more because facing the truth felt harder than signing a check. He reached into the folder once more and pulled out a small, printed photograph. It showed Evelyn on a weathered pier, a sketch pad in her lap as she drew the ocean at sunset. Your mother loved painting the water, he said softly. She'd sit for hours just trying to capture the way the light hit the waves. She said it made her feel connected to something larger than herself. Clara took the photo with careful fingers, studying her mother's concentrated expression. A faint, bittersweet smile touched her lips. I've always liked drawing horizons, she admitted. I never knew where that came from. They talked longer than they had intended. Clara shared fragmented memories of Julian, how he used to coach weekend soccer games, and the patient way he taught her how to change a tire on their old truck. Arthur, in turn, offered stories of Evelyn's stubborn streak, recounting how she had insisted on waitressing her way through college rather than taking a cent of his money. As the restaurant began to empty, Clara glanced at her watch. I should catch the last bus back, she said. Arthur signaled for the check. Let me drive you. It's the least I can do. She hesitated for a beat, then gave a small nod of agreement. The drive to the relief center was quiet, the city lights shimmering on the asphalt, which was still damp from an afternoon squall. When they pulled up to the chain-link gates, Clara paused with her hand on the door handle. This is a lot to take in, she said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I need some time to think. Take all the time you need, Arthur replied. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded and stepped out, disappearing into the pools of light around the entrance. Arthur watched until the door closed behind her, then drove back to his hotel. In his suite, he stood by the window once more, staring out at the dark, restless sea. The partial records were scattered across the desk, proof of his intent, but not yet proof of the outcome. He didn't have to wait long. Arthur's phone buzzed on the desk while he was reviewing his messages. The caller ID showed Caleb Ross. I have the preliminary report, Caleb said as soon as Arthur answered. His voice was clinical and professional. I've done a surface-level audit. There have been several large withdrawals over the last few years, all categorized as family expenses and educational costs for a dependent in the household. Arthur sat forward, his eyes narrowing. How substantial? We're looking at multiple six-figure transfers. On the surface, it's not immediately illegal. Guardians have a fair amount of latitude in how they manage a household. But the problem is that almost all the documentation for the educational portion points toward elite private school tuition and extracurriculars that don't align with Clara's records. Keep digging, Arthur instructed, his voice cold. I want vendor invoices. I want to see exactly whose name is on those receipts. He ended the call and stared at the ocean view, his mind turning over the possibilities. The labels Miriam used sounded reasonable enough on paper. Guardians often consolidated costs when raising multiple children. But the images of Clara sleeping on a gym cot haunted him. He decided to test the waters himself. He dialed the home number he hadn't used in years. Miriam answered on the third ring, her tone warm and practiced. Arthur. It's been an age. How are you? I'm in Texas, actually, he said evenly. I came down after hearing about the storm damage. How is the house holding up? We're managing, she replied smoothly. The repairs are mostly finished now. Insurance was a godsend. And Clara? Arthur asked. Is she back home yet? There was a split-second hesitation, a catch in her breath that would have been imperceptible to anyone else. She's still at the community center. You know how she is, always wanting to help. We have contractors finishing the guest wing, so things are quite cramped here. She insisted on staying there to volunteer. A younger, bright voice piped up in the background. Mom, who's on the phone? Miriam laughed lightly. It's your grandfather, Sophie. Say hello. Sophie came on the line, her voice chirpy and confident. Hi. Clara's obsessed with her charity work right now. She's really into the whole martyr thing. I've got midterms coming up, so I'm drowning in schoolwork. Sounds like you're both staying busy, Arthur said, maintaining a friendly tone. I'd like to stop by and see the place when it's convenient. Of course, Miriam said quickly. Just let us know when. We'd love to catch up. Arthur set the phone down slowly. Miriam's concern had sounded polished, Sophie's chatter was typical for a teenager. Yet it felt like a script performed one too many times. He met Clara the following afternoon at a quiet coffee shop near the shelter. She arrived in fresh clothes, likely from the donation bins, and her hair was still damp from a quick shower. Arthur recounted the phone call word for word, watching her closely. Clara stirred her iced tea, a small frown creasing her forehead. That's how she always puts it. She told me I should stay at the center because I wanted to help and because the house wasn't ready. But the repairs? Arthur pressed gently. She shrugged. They finished the main living areas weeks ago. Miriam told me the remaining work on the wings would be too noisy and dusty, and that it would be better for my health if I stayed away. Arthur nodded, letting the implications sink in. Sophie's comments don't surprise me either, Clara continued. She's been getting new laptops and specialized gear for her dance academy, while I've been making do with hand-me-downs, and whatever I can find at the thrift store. Miriam always says it's because Sophie's activities cost more. I figured it was only fair. Her defense of Miriam came out automatically, a product of years of habit. Arthur could hear the lingering loyalty in her voice. She was still the child hoping for fairness in a house where there was none. It's possible everything is technically legal, he said carefully, choosing his words to avoid spooking her. Caleb is just double-checking the routine withdrawals. Specifically the large ones for household and school costs. Clara looked up sharply. School costs? Arthur, I've been in public school since my dad died. Sophie is the only one at the prep academy downtown. Arthur didn't push further. He didn't have to. The seed of doubt had been planted, and he could see it taking root in the way Clara stared blankly at her glass. Forcing the issue now would only cause her to retreat. We'll wait for the facts, he assured her as they stood to leave. I'm not assuming anything yet. She nodded and headed back toward the shelter. Arthur watched her go, then returned to his hotel to wait for the next set of files. That evening, Caleb emailed the summaries. The educational line items were a perfect match for the tuition statements of an elite prep school, with Sophie's name on every single invoice. The family expenses included extensive home renovations and luxury vehicle leases registered solely to Miriam. It was still circumstantial in a broad legal sense. A guardian could argue these were shared household benefits. But Arthur was no longer interested in excuses. He texted Clara, "Sleep well. Talk soon." She replied with a simple thumbs up. Arthur lay awake for hours, listening to the distant sound of traffic, weighing his next move. A visit to the house was inevitable, but he needed Clara to be ready. He needed her to see the truth for herself. The rental sedan pulled into the circular driveway of the Vance residence in an exclusive gated suburb of Houston. The house was a sprawling, contemporary piece of architecture, white stucco, sharp lines, and perfectly manicured palms. There wasn't a single shingle out of place, no sign that a hurricane had ever touched the zip code. Arthur parked behind Caleb's discreet SUV. Clara sat in the back seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Caleb turned from the front passenger seat, his expression solemn. "Remember," he said. "We are here to ask questions and present the records. Let the documentation do the heavy lifting." Arthur nodded. They stepped out into the humid morning air. Clara hesitated at the threshold of the driveway, smoothing her simple sundress. Miriam opened the door almost immediately, a wide, practiced smile on her face. "Arthur, how wonderful. And Clara, honey, it's so good to have you home." She reached out to hug Clara, a brief, sterile gesture, before ushering them inside. The foyer opened into a vast living space with soaring ceilings and brand new leather furniture. Abstract art hung on walls that smelled faintly of fresh paint. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs, dressed in designer leggings and a cropped top, her phone glued to her hand. She descended with a practiced grace. "Hi, grandfather." "Hey, sis." Arthur returned the greeting, his voice flat. They settled in the living area, Miriam and Sophie on the long designer sofa, Arthur and Caleb in the armchairs. Clara sat on a side chair, positioned slightly apart from everyone else. Miriam offered coffee, and Caleb accepted for the group to maintain a veneer of civility. Once the cups were passed, Arthur placed a thick leather folder on the glass coffee table. "Thank you for seeing us," Arthur began. "I've been reviewing the trust activity with Caleb. There are significant discrepancies that I hope you can clarify." Miriam's smile didn't falter. "Of course. I'm happy to help." Arthur opened the folder to a highlighted summary. Over $3 million has been deposited into this trust since its inception. Yet the recent withdrawals don't seem to reflect any direct benefit to Clara. He slid the page across the table. Miriam glanced at it, her expression remaining calm. "Those are family expenses, Arthur," she said smoothly. "Raising two girls in this city isn't cheap. Roof repairs, utilities, groceries, we all share this roof." Caleb leaned forward. "The line items specify educational costs for a dependent and household maintenance. Can you walk us through some of the larger figures?" Miriam nodded. "Certainly. Sophie's tuition at the Oakwood Academy is nearly $50,000 a year. Then there are the dance competitions, the specialized coaching, it adds up." Sophie chimed in, her voice bright. "And the trip to the Caymans last spring was a lifesaver. Mom said we needed it to decompress after the storm stress." Clara shifted in her seat, her eyes widening. Arthur remained a statue. Caleb flipped to another page. "This withdrawal for $60,000 is listed as a home renovation," Caleb noted. "But the contractor invoices are for a bespoke bedroom suite and a walk-in closet in Sophie's name." Miriam waved a hand dismissively. "It was an upstairs renovation. Clara had her room too." "But Clara hasn't lived here in months," Caleb pointed out quietly. And this luxury vehicle lease is registered solely to you. Miriam's smile finally tightened. It's a family car. It benefits everyone. Sophie scrolled through her phone. Clara never wanted fancy things anyway. She's always been basic. The word hung in the air like a taunt. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she remained silent. Arthur spoke for the first time since the documents came out, his voice vibrating with a low, dangerous frequency. This trust was established for Clara's future. Texas law is quite clear: while a guardian may use funds for reasonable expenses, the bulk must benefit the named beneficiary. These records show nothing for her. No college fund, no personal savings, not even a car in her name. Miriam straightened her back. I've raised her since she was a child. Food, clothes, a roof, that is benefit enough. The money kept this household running. Caleb produced more pages, invoices for jewelry, European vacations, and a pool installation. None of these mentioned Clara. Miriam's composure cracked a fraction. Bank errors happen. Or perhaps the lawyers mislabeled the transfers. Sophie looked up, sensing the shift in the room. Mom did everything for us. Clara just didn't want the same things. She never complained. Clara finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. I didn't complain because I thought we couldn't afford it. Miriam shot her a sharp, silencing glance. We managed just fine. Arthur's gaze was unwavering. Where is the money, Miriam? Miriam's eyes darted between them. It went into raising my family, she snapped, her voice rising. Evelyn had everything handed to her, rich parents, a perfect husband. When she died, suddenly there was all this money for her child. I had to make it work for everyone. Sophie frowned. Mom. Miriam continued, the words tumbling faster. Why should only one child have every advantage? Sophie deserved opportunities too. Caleb closed the folder with a definitive thud. These patterns suggest an intentional diversion of funds. In this jurisdiction, that is embezzlement. Miriam stood abruptly. You're twisting this. I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who sacrificed. Arthur looked at Clara, who met his eyes with a quiet, heartbreaking resolve. Caleb stepped into the hallway and made a brief, quiet call. Uniformed officers arrived within minutes. They were local police, responding to a report of financial fraud with the forensic documentation already in hand. Miriam's protests grew shrill as they explained the process. You can't do this in my home. She cried out. Sophie dropped her phone, her eyes wide with shock. Mom? What's happening? Miriam turned to her daughter, her face crumpling. It's a misunderstanding, baby. Call the lawyers. The officers cuffed Miriam gently but firmly, reading her rights. She went silent, staring at the floor as they led her out to the patrol car. Sophie followed them to the doorway, watching the flashing lights with an expression of pure disbelief. Clara remained seated, her breathing deep and measured. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder. Caleb gathered the documents. We'll need copies for the state's attorney. Sophie turned back into the house, her voice trembling. This is crazy. Mom wouldn't steal. But the evidence scattered across the coffee table told a different story. Arthur guided Clara to the car. She paused at the threshold, looking back once at the girl standing in the shadow of the massive foyer. Caleb produced another stack of documents, itemized invoices for Mediterranean cruises, high-end jewelry, and the installation of a heated infinity pool. These records cover the last 3 years, he said. Your name is on every purchase. Clara's name doesn't appear once. Miriam's composure fractured. She looked at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. Bank errors happen, she stammered. Or perhaps the accountants mislabeled the files. It's a large household. Sophie looked up from her screen, the tension finally piercing her bubble of indifference. Mom did everything for both of us, she insisted. Clara just didn't want the same things. She never complained about her clothes or not having a new car. Clara finally spoke, her voice cutting through the room with a terrifying clarity. I didn't complain because you told me we were struggling, Miriam. I didn't ask for things because I thought we couldn't afford them. Miriam shot her a look of pure, sharp venom. We managed just fine. You were never without a meal or a bed. Arthur's voice remained low, a dangerous rumble. Where is the money, Miriam? Where did my daughter's legacy go? The question seemed to break something inside her. Miriam stood, her face flushed with a sudden, ugly heat. It went into raising my family. She shouted. Evelyn had everything handed to her, wealthy parents, a perfect husband, a silver spoon life. When she died, there was suddenly this mountain of gold for her child. I had to make it work for the whole house. Sophie stared at her mother, her expression faltering. Mom. Why should only one child get every advantage? Miriam continued, her words spilling out in a torrent of long-held resentment. Sophie deserved those opportunities just as much. I was the one who did the work. I was the one who stayed. Caleb closed the leather folder with a heavy, final thud. These records show a systematic diversion of funds. This isn't a misunderstanding, Miriam. It's embezzlement. Arthur looked at Clara. She met his gaze with a quiet, exhausted resolve. She didn't look triumphant, she looked like someone seeing a monster in the light for the first time. Caleb stepped into the foyer and made a short, quiet call. The police arrived 10 minutes later. They were local detectives, already briefed on the forensic evidence. Miriam's protests turned into shrill cries as they explained the charges and the arrest process. You can't do this. Not in front of my daughter. She screamed. Sophie dropped her phone, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. Mom, what's happening? Why are they touching you? Miriam turned to her, her face a mask of crumbling desperation. It's a mistake, Sophie. Just a terrible mistake. Call the firm. Call the lawyers. The officers cuffed Miriam with a professional, clinical efficiency. She went suddenly silent, staring at the polished hardwood floor as they led her out to the waiting cruiser. Sophie followed them to the porch, clutching the doorframe as she watched the patrol car pull away. Confusion was slowly hardening into a cold, sharp shock. Clara remained in her chair, her breathing slow and measured. Arthur placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent anchor. Caleb began gathering the documents. The state's attorney will need the original digital logs for the case file, he noted. Sophie turned back into the house, her voice trembling. This is insane. My mother isn't a thief. But the evidence scattered across the designer coffee table told a different story. Arthur guided Clara toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back once at the girl standing alone in the center of the vast, hollow house. The drive away from the suburbs felt like a fever dream, the lush green lawns and palm trees blurring into a smear of color through the window. Over the following months, the criminal courthouse in downtown Houston became a grim, familiar landscape. The proceedings were grueling. Miriam's defense team filed motion after motion, challenging the chain of custody on the bank records, and arguing that the withdrawals fell under the broad discretion granted to a guardian under state law. Arthur and Clara attended every session, sitting in the gallery directly behind the prosecution. Caleb worked in tandem with the district attorney, presenting the evidence with a methodical, cold precision that left no room for emotional manipulation. The lead prosecutor opened the trial by outlining a decades-long pattern of theft, funds intended for one child's survival and future being redirected to fund luxury lifestyles, and the exclusive benefit of another. Miriam's attorney countered that every cent had gone toward maintaining the household, where Clara lived, claiming any disparity was merely an unintentional result of different interests between the two girls. The forensic accountants were the first to take the stand. They projected massive spreadsheets onto the courtroom screens, highlighting the monthly deposits from Arthur's accounts followed by immediate, rapid outflows to high-end boutiques, travel agencies, and private academies. Tuition payments for the Oakwood Academy appeared like clockwork, every invoice bearing Sophie's name. Miriam sat perfectly still at the defense table, her expression composed and distant. Sophie attended several days, dressed in conservative, somber clothing, sitting with a family friend. When she was called as a witness for the defense, she walked to the stand with visible tremors in her hands. The defense attorney asked her about their home life. "Mom always made sure we were taken care of," Sophie said, her voice small. "We had food, a roof, clothes. She treated us both the same." The prosecutor's cross-examination was gentle but devastating. He introduced a series of text messages recovered from Sophie's phone via subpoena. In them, Sophie had bragged to her friends about her new designer bags and upcoming trips to the islands, while in the same threads, she had mocked Clara's charity bin wardrobe. Sophie looked from her mother to the jury, her face pale. I guess Mom bought more for me because I was the one who asked for it," she whispered. "I didn't think it was wrong." The admission hung in the silent courtroom like a verdict. Miriam's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Clara testified the following week. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a neat, severe knot. Her voice never wavered. "I received the bare minimum," she told the court. "I had a room and public school tuition. But anything beyond the basics, I was told we couldn't afford. I started working at 16 to pay for my own shoes, my own books, my own life." The prosecutor asked her to recall specific instances. Clara spoke calmly of the years she spent taking the city bus to a part-time job, while Sophie was driven to private lessons in a new SUV. She spoke of the new furniture that arrived for the younger girl's suite, while her own room remained a relic of her childhood. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply told the truth, and the jury watched her with a heavy, focused silence. Clara did not raise her voice. She did not shed a single tear on the stand. The jury watched her with a heavy, unblinking focus, captivated by her steady delivery. Arthur took the stand briefly afterward to confirm the purpose of the trust, a safety net established solely for Clara's security following Evelyn's death. He acknowledged his mistake in granting such broad powers to a guardian, but his testimony was clear: the money was meant for his granddaughter, and no one else. Miriam was the final witness for the defense. She maintained a defiant front, insisting that the fund had sustained the entire family unit, and that any disparity in spending merely reflected the different interests of the two girls. "I loved them both," she claimed from the stand. That money provided the stability they both needed to grow. Cross-examination was brutal. When the prosecutor presented jewelry receipts and luxury vacation bookings that pointedly excluded Clara, Miriam's composure finally shattered. She blamed accounting errors, gifts from anonymous sources, and administrative oversights. It was a desperate performance that convinced no one. Closing arguments summarized months of agonizing testimony. The prosecutor hammered home the point of intent, the repeated, conscious choices to favor one child while the named beneficiary was left with the barest minimum. Miriam's lawyer made a final plea for the jury to understand the complexities of modern family dynamics, but it felt hollow. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with a suffocating tension. The foreperson stood. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts of embezzlement and fraud." Miriam showed no outward reaction, her face a mask of cold stone. In the gallery, Sophie buried her face in her hands and wept. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge reviewed the victim impact statements, including a letter from Clara that the prosecutor read aloud. It was a document focused on lost time and stolen opportunities rather than vengeance. The sentence was severe: 12 years in a federal facility, and an order for full restitution. Every asset traceable to the diverted funds, the residence, the vehicles, the private accounts, will be seized and liquidated to restore the trust, the judge announced. Sophie faced no charges. She had been a minor during the bulk of the transactions, and was viewed as an indirect beneficiary rather than a criminal participant. Court services arranged for her to live with a maternal aunt in a small town in North Texas, in a modest apartment worlds away from the luxury she had known. Arthur and Clara walked out of the courthouse into the blinding Texas sunlight. Reporters swarmed the steps, but Caleb steered them through the crowd to a waiting car. As they drove away, Clara stared out at the passing skyline. "It's over," she said. Arthur nodded. "The legal battle is, yes." She turned to him, her eyes searching. "I thought I'd feel differently. I don't feel like I won. I just feel empty." "That's to be expected, Clara." He reached over and squeezed her hand. "Healing takes much longer than a trial." They flew to Denver that evening. While the seized assets would eventually rebuild the trust, the money felt like a secondary concern now. Sophie's new life began in silence, no private academies, no extravagant allowances. Her aunt provided a firm structure and the expectation of a part-time job. Miriam began her sentence at a federal facility, her life now defined by the rigid routines of the penal system. Clara stepped into Arthur's spacious penthouse for the first time, with a single suitcase in hand. The polished marble floors and the panoramic views of the snow-capped Rockies felt overwhelming, almost intrusive. Arthur led her to a grand guest suite, but she stopped at the door. "I'm not ready for all this space," she told him quietly. "Could I stay in the smaller room? Or maybe the study off the library?" Arthur understood without question. He prepared a comfortable corner room with a simple daybed and understated furnishings. Clara unpacked slowly, placing her few belongings in the drawers. The quiet luxuries of the apartment still felt like a borrowed life. She enrolled in the social work program at a local university, starting with introductory courses. The classroom discussions on community support and family systems resonated with her on a level she couldn't yet articulate. She spent her first semester listening more than speaking, absorbing the theories of recovery and resilience. Arthur never pushed her. They shared quiet evening meals prepared by his longtime housekeeper. Over tea, they talked about Evelyn. Clara asked questions about her mother's teenage years, and Arthur told her how Evelyn used to organize clothing drives, and how she believed that small, quiet acts were the only way to rebuild trust in a broken world. "I should have looked closer," he admitted one night. "I trusted the paperwork because it was easier than looking at the people. That was my failure." Clara stirred her tea. "We both trusted too easily. We were both told what we wanted to hear." Together they decided to channel the recovered funds into something with a legacy. Caleb helped them establish a private foundation named in honor of Evelyn Thorne. Its mission was narrow and focused, providing emergency housing grants and mentorship for young adults displaced by natural disasters. The first round of grants was sent back to families on the Texas coast who were still struggling to rebuild. Clara spent her evenings reviewing the applications, matching needs with resources. Seeing the direct impact of the money gave her a sense of purpose that the trial never could. Then, one afternoon, a plain envelope arrived at the foundation office. Inside was a handwritten letter from Sophie. "I've had time to think about everything," the letter began. "I knew Mom favored me, and I never questioned it. The things I said to you, calling you lazy, mocking your clothes, they were cruel. I'm sorry. I wish I could take them back." Clara read the words twice in the quiet of her room. The ink held a genuine note of regret, but the memories of a decade spent on the sidelines were still too vivid to be erased by a single page. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the back of a desk drawer. She didn't reply, nor did she throw it away. She made no effort to contact Miriam or Sophie. No visits were scheduled, no updates sought. Miriam was serving her sentence in a minimum security facility where the days were long, rigid, and stripped of the vanity she had once prized. Her former social circles in Houston had closed ranks, protecting their own reputations by simply pretending she had never existed. Sophie adjusted to her new reality in North Texas with a quiet, jarring stoicism. There were no private academies or extravagant allowances now, only a public high school, and a part-time shift at a local diner. The shift from privilege to the mundane was a sharp one, but she carried it without public complaint, fading into the background of a life she had once looked down upon. Clara's own life found a steady, healing rhythm. Her mornings were occupied by university lectures, her afternoons by volunteer shifts at a Denver crisis center, and her evenings by the work of the foundation. Arthur joined the board meetings whenever his health permitted, offering a quiet, steady guidance that Clara had come to rely on. Trust returned to the penthouse in increments. Eventually, she felt ready to move into the larger suite. They took long walks through the city parks, discussing literature or the quiet complexities of the world. Arthur shared more of the past, old albums filled with photos of Evelyn at her graduation, or a candid shot of her holding a newborn Clara just days before the complications took her. Some nights, the old doubts would resurface. Clara wondered if the feeling of being invisible in her own home would ever truly vanish. "I'm learning that boundaries aren't an act of selfishness," she told Arthur after an afternoon therapy session. "Choosing not to reach out doesn't mean I'm trapped in the past. It means I'm protective of the peace I've finally found." Arthur listened without a hint of judgment, a silent anchor in her new world. The Evelyn Thorne Foundation expanded slowly but with intention. A second round of grants was approved to support tutoring programs for teenagers displaced by the hurricane. Clara spoke at a small gathering for donors, her voice unwavering as she explained that stable housing and a sense of belonging mattered far more than the figures in a bank account. Standing on the penthouse balcony one crisp, clear evening, the lights of Denver sparkling like fallen stars below, Clara reflected on the long, jagged road she had traveled. "Money can vanish in an instant," she said softly to the mountain air. "And trust can be broken by the very people sworn to protect it. But no one can take away the choice to keep going, the decision to turn your own pain into a bridge for someone else." She thought of the families receiving aid, of the students like her who were being given a second chance to breathe. "Some wounds don't heal perfectly," she continued, her voice a whisper. "They leave scars. Scars are just reminders that we survived. And survival isn't the destination. It's the starting point for deciding who we want to become next." Arthur joined her at the railing, a quiet companion in the cold night air. Clara leaned against the cold metal, breathing in the scent of pine and distant snow. The trust fund had been restored through the slow machinery of the law, but its original purpose felt like a relic of a different life. What mattered now were the remnants she had used to build something new, the quiet mornings with a man who truly knew her, the work that gave her days a reason, and the hard-won understanding that a person's worth is never measured by what is given or stolen. She turned back toward the warmth of the apartment, closing the glass door behind her.